what's happened over the last 20 years has been the reconnection of philosophy and psychology.
Oh, okay.
Right? Yeah. So philosophy and psychology were intimately related and not even conceived of really as separate disciplines until the late 19th century, early 20th century. And then they separated.
Do you think that's what, briefly, is that very like Freudian and all that psychoanalytical stuff? Is that because that was around the same time?
Yeah,
or?
I don't think it's as much Freud because that was not as much in academia.
Sure, or Jung or something.
As the experimental philosophy.
Sure.
People like Helmholtz early on, and then later experimental psychologists.
Got it.
Dividing away from non-experimental philosophers. And the disciplines stayed very separate for basically the whole 20th century. And then recently, I think, there's been this tendency in all areas of philosophy, whether it's ethics, whether it's philosophy of mind, philosophy of language, aesthetics, to some extent metaphysics, right, to reconnect with psychology and see the relevance of psychology and empirical work for philosophy and not think of philosophy as this completely a priori thing that you do in your armchair without having to consult.
Like we start with the brain at first, like we have to take into the brain. Like, you know what I mean? Like that's
you do it with your brain.
Yeah,
so your brain is definitely involved.
Yeah.
And the more we know about the brain, the more we know about at least the process by which we're reaching our philosophical conclusions. So that has to be relevant to philosophy. So I found it really exciting over the last couple of decades how basically all of philosophy is reconnecting with empirical stuff, and especially with empirical psychology.
That's great because I think it almost hints into as well the developments around us in like the state and of the universe, or not the universe, but like Earth. Is that in chaotic times, at least I've read in previous times, in chaotic times, like people look for that truth, that knowledge, that they have that yearning, for some of this, and maybe that's kind of one of the connections of the last 20 years is that people really have been yearning for this type of information, I think. I mean, or at least I mean, people like me who are naturally curious, I think, are yearning for that kind of stuff. So we already kind of talked about philosophers, like, and having a certain value to the society that they're a part of, and then maybe philosophy in general. But we're here in the UC Riverside Philosophy Library with some of, names such as Kant, Hegel, Locke, Hume, et cetera. But who's someone that like maybe a regular person, like a layman, that maybe they may not know, what I mean, a philosopher, and they might be interested in that. I mean, more as someone that just interested in say, hey, what's an esoteric philosopher? Is it the Chinese philosophers that you mentioned, or is there another name that comes to mind, like a Wittgenstein or something like that?
Like a philosopher I might recommend.
Yeah, like for a normal person that's just say they work a regular job, like how would they get in and be interested? Is it a Sartre, or is it Camus' writing, or is it that kind of stuff?
Yeah, well, I've always loved philosophers who are great writers. So Zhuangzi is wonderfully fun if you like that kind of thing. I mean, people might know the most famous part of the Zhuangzi is his butterfly dream.
Okay.
Your viewers might have heard this story before. Zhuangzi dreamt that he was a butterfly. Okay. Floating around, doing whatever he liked, not thinking about much, right? And then he wakes up, and there he is, a human. And then he thinks, wait, am I a human who just dreamt he was a butterfly, or am I a butterfly now dreaming that I'm a human?
That's great.
Right? So that's like, wow, that's weird and cool, right, in this ancient Chinese philosopher. Right, so he's wonderful and weird.
Right.
Another philosopher I think that is a wonderful writer sometimes that readers might be able to connect with is John Stuart Mill.
Okay.
Like On Liberty.
Okay,
is a really wonderful essay about the value of liberty and freedom of thought and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. So it's not weird in the same way that
right,
but it's a really wonderful piece, I think. I also really love Montaigne.
Okay.
He's this.
I read On Solitude.
Yeah, right. He's this early French philosopher.
That was hard. That was very technical. That was weird. Like you had to start a little bit because it's so old. It's like what 1500s, I think.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's old, But he's so personal.
Oh, totally. Yeah.
He's
yeah.
he kind of partly invented the personal essay, right? Where he's just kind of like, well, here are my thoughts about things,
sure.
and he kind of rambles off in different directions, and he's always interesting.
That's so good. Okay, so then I'm gonna put this as a segue in that. How has teaching and being a professional, I guess you could say, professional philosopher, if you will, or academic philosopher, changed your life? Because I understand, obviously we talked about before about the ethics and moral psychology and stuff. Is like, do you think you personally are more like inclined philosophically? It's like, what are your thoughts now? Being in the biz, if you will, for the last 30 years, and then obviously that's different than when you came, young buck, into Searles postgraduate, kind of grad student. So, like, how have you changed personally in this?
Wow, that's interesting. I don't know, because I've kind of been an academic nerd my whole life. So, if I hadn't gone into philosophy, what
are you?
What would I have been? I don't know. I mean, I've always been a writer, and I've always been kind of undisciplined in thinking about big picture issues about things. So I think, like, if I'd gone into finance or something like that, I'd
be hyper attuned to
I'd
that.
probably be like super philosophical. Anyway.
Yeah. No,
I don't know. So I don't have a very good answer to your question.
Well, I mean, maybe then how has your teaching style changed? Or like, because you also said you have a wife and 2 kids. Like, well, your personal life outside of work obviously is not dictated, but maybe influenced by, your career that you chose.
I will tell you one way in which my teaching style has changed. And it's connected a little bit with what I was saying about the blog, too. So at the lower division level, at UCR we have these giant classes of hundreds of students. At the lower division level, I had for a few years taught Introduction to Philosophy, and I taught some issues I thought were really interesting, like how is the mind related to the body, and does God exist, and what is it to be a person? I think I focused on those 3 specific issues. And then the students are like, yeah. And I thought the issues are really interesting, but it was not connecting with the students. And I kind of respect that yawning, right? Like, if they're yawning, if they're bored, then they're not learning, and it's kind of your fault as the teacher.
You have to have some onus of that problem. Yeah.
Everybody's interested in philosophy. So if they're not interested in your philosophy, then you're doing something wrong as a teacher, I think. I mean, that's a little harshly put, but
no, to get the argument across.
We're here. Add some nuance to that. So, so I totally redesigned the class, and I now call it Evil.
Okay.
And we start with lynching photography.
Okay.
So, and I usually teach this in the fall term to the brand new students right out of high school, right? And the very first reading is like, all right. And the thing about I focus mostly on photographs where the white people who are perpetrating these racially motivated lynchings in the United States and the South in the early 20th century mostly.
Oh, the most famous photo is the 2 men hanging from, a rope in, I think, Mississippi or something, and then you just see like 100 eyes looking at the photographer, and that's right. That's a very...
There's a lot of photos like that. So that's one of the photos I use, and lots of others like that, right? And then the question is like, and a lot of times these people who are being killed, it's like they didn't do anything. Even the white people who killed them are like, well, she lied to a police officer.
Something like that, something ridiculous.
Not a capital crime.
Yeah.
Her son did something. So, and these people are proud. They're smiling for the camera. Yeah. There is you can read the descriptions of the torture. There's a mutilated corpse they've just tortured.
Yeah.
They are sometimes just a few feet away from it. They bring their children.
Literally, kids are right there. I've seen that. Yep.
And it's like, okay, what is going on in these people's minds?
Right.
That is the question of this class.
Wow.
Right. Wow. So I give them that. That's the question of the class, and the students are like, I mean, some students are bored still. Anyway, right?
I think
but they're much more interested.
Sometimes is bored.
They're much more interested. And then we get into I talked about Mengzi and Xunzi and human nature, right? Like, so if Mengzi is right, all these people, if they stopped and they thought about it, there's some part of them that would be like, this is horrible, how can I be doing this?
Right.
And they're just not thinking about it. They're not really reflecting. And if they reflected, they would know, like, we should not murder this woman because her son did something, right?
Right. Yeah.
If Shunz is right, if Monks is right, that's right, right? And and Shunz is like, no way, look at these people, right? Obviously, Shunz is not saying that, right? But like a Shunzian perspective is like, no, look, morality is an artificial social construction. If you're in a social environment that says this is morally okay, that's what you're going to think.
Yeah.
Right? You don't have this internal resource that's going to tell you something else, right? These people are smiling. This is, they don't have these hearts that Mengzi thinks they have. Right? And then the class becomes this question about, okay, is Mengzi right? Is Shunzi right? Is there some other alternative view that's right? Let's look at the history of the Holocaust. Let's look at moral psychology.
Sure.
Let's look at social psychology. Let's look at primate behavior.
Mm-hmm.
Let's look at all these things and try to address this question, and then the students care.
Well, that's interesting because it's almost like and now forgive me of anything, but obviously I don't want to armchair teach your class, but it seems like at first maybe it was a top-down approach of like, I'm going to give you these things and you're supposed to be enthralled by philosophy at the end of this, rather than like take the most enthralling philosophical argument, throw it right in the beginning, and then we talk about from a bottom-up approach, how do we get there? How do we figure out how to deal with that?
Exactly, because I think everybody is interested in philosophy, right? So the way to teach it is you meet them where they're interested.
Right.
And then you show how it connects back into these issues that they might not have realized that they would be interested in.
That's great. That's great. And so we talked briefly before about the influences when you were growing up, being a lot of writers, et cetera, maybe some science fiction in there. But how has that changed? How has your influences changed over time of like who, obviously you have to do your work and your discipline and your academia, but like how has, and this can go out into life, if you will, but how have your influences into life, what shapes your worldview, what then shapes your philosophical view, changed over the years? Because I'm assuming, like for me, when I was growing up, it was, very different than what it is now, just by the sheer facts of, like you said, your social construct, but then also how I was raised. We're all each our own person, but how have you changed, not just philosophically, but your influences?
My influences are really not very consistent over time.
That's a good, okay.
So I think I said at one point that I'm undisciplined in a certain kind of way, and it's self-conscious. I trust my sense of fun.
So you really look for that. Okay.
I encourage people to trust their sense of fun. So I think, if you find something fun and interesting, like go chase it down and like figure out, because there's something in you that's like, I don't think we find things fun intellectually, unless we're learning something. We might not know why it is we find it fun or what we're learning, but there's something in us that's like, wow, this is so cool, this is so interesting, right? So I trust that in myself,
right.
And it's always something different. It could be like snails.
Is that
right?
Is that so benign as like your childlike curiosity still being around now though?
Yes.
Because I know a lot of people though that may not, they may intuitively think that deep down, but they're not showing that. They're not actively trying to be curious, but at the same time, like whenever I feel the need to be curious and then you go munch on that thing, there's so much fulfilling, and you just don't know where it's going to go.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's the big thing.
Exactly. And one of the wonderful things about philosophy is it always comes around.
Right.
Because everything is connected, right? And because like my mind is going to bring it around somehow or other, right? Regardless.
We'll connect these dots.
But it's like there's nothing more deadening as an academic than to think, this is what I do, this is what I have to do, this is what I have to read, this is what I'm going to do, this is what I have to do, and I'm going to do it again. Right?
Yeah.
And like, it's so boring and so tiring. So it's like, whoa, snail sex is so weird. Like, how do they do that? Snail brains are totally weird, right? Let me go like learn everything I can about that and, bug snail researchers.
And parse out a philosophical argument out of this. Yeah.
Or like science fiction. Whoa, this science fiction is so interesting, right? Let me go read it and learn more about it, right? And whenever I do that, I end up in a place that I like eventually.
Okay.
So it's not so much like a consistent influence. It's really more of a kind of letting myself be taken and as I liked your metaphor of chewing on the the thing that feeds your curiosity. And one of my advisors was Allison Gopnik, right? And I don't know if you know her work at all. She'd be another great person to think about interviewing.
Allison Gopnik, let's go.
She's a developmental psychologist.
Okay.
And she loves the way children think. And she thinks that scientists are basically kind of big children.
Oh, well.
She thinks that what happens in childhood is that she describes childhood as research and development, and adulthood as sales and marketing.
Okay, makes sense. Yeah. Totally. Yeah,
Right?
sales and very good point. You're trying to sell something and you're trying to look the best, market yourself. Yeah.
Right? And the children, right, their minds are open to all kinds of things. They're learning all kinds of things.
Yeah.
I love 4-year-olds in particular. I know Allison does too, right? They're so weird. Their way of thinking about the world. They're 4-year-olds. They're sophisticated enough linguistically to say things that are removed from the immediate moment, but their minds are so different from ours.
Right.
Speaking about different minds, and they say the strangest things.
Yeah.
So I love 4-year-olds, and right. So the scientist, and I think also the creative philosopher, in Allison Gopnik's view, is someone who keeps their childlike mind, their childlike flexibility and curiosity and kind of lack of discipline to some extent, right? And is learning and shaping new ways of thinking all the time out of a kind of childlike curiosity.
That's amazing. But my only question is, when would we not want that? You know what I mean? Like, why is that not the key to, you know what I mean? Like, when would we not want that?
Well,
I just don't, you know what I mean?
If your whole company is,
right.
research and development.
Somewhat facetious, but yeah, you know what I mean? But at the same time, it's like, wouldn't you always want like more diverse knowledge and thought, and be able to chew things? But at the same time, like, yeah, if you're straight razored edge on something, then that's, I guess, okay in that discipline.
I think there are a lot of short and medium term benefits as an academic.
I see.
To going for, this is the thing I'm expert on, I'm going to add this twist to it, or do it again. This is the thing that's hot in the field right now, so I should contribute to this discipline. This is the thing that will advance my career. This is like, science fiction is not even respectable philosophy or whatever, right? There's a lot of pressures in the short and medium term to be more on the marketing and sales side, right?
Absolutely.
But I do think long term, being more childlike and trusting your sense of fun is win-win, right? It's both more enjoyable as an academic process, and if you can survive the short-term hits, and tenure helps.
Tenure helps. Other things help. Yeah.
If you can survive the short-term hits, then in the long term, you've got a kind of engagement and fun in your. I mean, if you find your work boring, other people are going to find your work boring too.
Oh, surely.
Right?
Well, that's what I was thinking about with writing. It was like, that was the biggest things that I thought was that, like, if I'm not willing to read my own stuff, why would anyone else? You know what I mean? And then it's like you try and put some literary devices or metaphors and analogy to make it fun, but then it becomes then fun to then figure out what is fun. You know, that, you know, that whole deal.